Good morning. I want us to start the lecture now. We are going to this morning look at functional localization of the cerebral cortex. You remember this is still part of the neuroanatomy lecture series. Having started on the same sometime back where we looked at introduction to the nervous system, and in that introduction, we clarified on a number of things, including divisions of the nervous system, cell types of the nervous system, and the like. We also looked at section 2, where we looked at the parts of the cranial cavity, the components of the meninges, as well as parts of the brain. Perhaps just a small recap on the parts of the brain. First, we agreed that the nervous system can be anatomically divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. When you talk of the central nervous system, we are referring to the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is housed within the cranial cavity, while the spinal cord is housed within the vertebral canal. When you talk of peripheral nervous system, we are referring to cranial nerves as well as spinal nerves. Peripheral nervous system refer to basically nerves which are outside the brain, outside the spinal cord. So we name them according to where the nerves come from. The cranial nerves are a total of 12 pairs. They come from the brain, or at least they have attachment to the brain. The spinal nerves are a total of 31 pairs. Excuse me. The spinal nerves are a total of 31 pairs, 8 in the cervical region, 12 in the thoracic region, 5 in the lumbar segment, 5 in the sacral segment, and 1 for coccygeal segment, a total of 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Don't confuse the pairs of spinal nerves with the number of vertebrae. So this is how we divided the nervous system anatomically. With regard to parts of the brain, we then agreed that the brain has 3 basic parts. That big part that is outlined by the blue is what we call the cerebrum. The smaller one, outlined by the red, is what we call the cerebellum. And the region outlined by the green is what we call the brainstem. We further stated that the brainstem has 3 parts. That small part up there is what we call the midbrain. And then this one here in the middle is what we call pons. And the one below is what we call medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is the one that continues with the spinal cord. This basic naming system is what we say that is commonly used, but we also stated that there's another naming system that can be used where you look at the brain in terms of forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. When you use the term forebrain, or otherwise called Prosencephalon, it is referring to the cerebrum. When you use the term midbrain, or otherwise called mesencephalon, it is referring to this region only, which is the same as our midbrain we talked about anyway. Then when we talk of hindbrain, otherwise called rhombencephalon, we are referring to these 3 components: pons, medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. That is what constitutes the hindbrain, or rhombencephalon. So you need to be familiar with this naming system as well as this naming system. This is particularly important from embryological point of view because the brain tends to develop from those three parts. With regard to parts of the cerebrum, we agreed that the cerebrum is further divided into what we call the cerebral hemispheres, where we have the right and the left hemisphere joined by corpus callosum. This is the corpus callosum. Apart from the hemispheres, we also agreed that the cerebrum also contains a region we are calling the Rhombencephalon, which is around here. So that cerebrum has the hemispheres and the Rhombencephalon. If you narrow down to the hemisphere, we agree that the hemisphere has three components. If you look at it in cross-section, the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of gray matter there, the cerebral white matter, and the basal nuclei. You can see that the hemispheres are still connected by the corpus callosum here. Now, with regard to the cortex, we agreed also that the cortex is highly convoluted, as you can see, and perhaps better visualized on this other image, where the surface of the cortex is not really a plane. It is highly convoluted. The convolutions of the cerebral cortex increases the surface area of the cerebral cortex so that the brain can then fit even in a small region, despite the need to have the cerebral cortex being as big as possible. Therefore, the cerebral cortex is highly convoluted. The elevations are called gyri, and the depressions, we name them as sulci. This is just to state that in a different way, that yes, we have three parts of the brain: brainstem, cerebrum, and cerebellum. The cerebrum has two components, the hemispheres and the Rhombencephalon. The cerebral hemispheres is further divided into three: the cerebral white matter, the cerebral cortex, and the basal nuclei, otherwise called the basal ganglia, although that's a misnomer, as we agreed. We mentioned that when you talk of the cerebral white matter, you are referring to axons of fibers within the white matter of the cerebrum. And these axons of fibers within the cerebral white matter can be grouped into three categories. There are those that we call commissural fibers. Commissural fibers join the right and the left parts of the brain. Examples of commissural fibers include the corpus callosum being the largest. Apart from corpus callosum, there are other commissural fibers. I doubt if I gave you their names, but they're not really difficult to remember because they all end with commissure, like anterior commissure, posterior commissure, and the like. Anyway, at least I want you to remember the corpus callosum and that it is the largest commissural fiber. Apart from commissural fibers, we talked of association fibers. Association fibers join different cortical regions within the same hemisphere. So it's limited to one hemisphere, either the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, but different cortical regions within the same hemisphere. Then we clarified on projection fibers, being the fibers that connect the cerebral cortex to regions which are outside the cerebral cortex, connect the cerebral cortex to subcortical regions. That is with regard to the cerebral white matter. With regard to the cerebral cortex, we mentioned that the cortex, yes, it is convoluted. There are many gyri and sulci, but there's some sulci that we can use to divide the brain into lobes. And sure enough, we did divide the cerebral cortex into 4 lobes: the frontal cortex, parietal cortex, occipital cortex, and temporal cortex. Perhaps that's where we left last time, having divided the cerebral cortex into the 4 lobes. And this was it, that the elevations are called gyri, the depressions are called sulci. 2 important depressions, the one labeled A, lateral sulcus, and the one labeled B, central sulcus. Now, if you put central sulcus here, or we call it Rolandic sulcus, and lateral sulcus here, which we also call the Sylvian fissure, you define a lobe here, which we call the frontal lobe. You also define another lobe down here, which we call the temporal lobe. The one labeled 3 is what we call the Parietal Lobe. The 4th lobe, which is occipital lobe, is posteriorly here. But if you want to see occipital lobe well in terms of its demarcations, then perhaps a better view is the medial view as opposed to a lateral view. And on that medial view, there's a deep sulcus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. This one here is what we call the parieto-occipital sulcus, now defining the occipital lobe better. On a medial view, we don't see such a big sulcus, and so it might be difficult. But either way, whatever is behind is the occipital lobe. So now we can say that we have 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex. Let's talk about the microscopic structure of the cerebral cortex. Having mentioned that this outer layer of gray matter is the cerebral cortex, this outer layer of gray matter is the cerebral cortex. Usually, the cerebral cortex is about 2 to 4 millimeters thick. This is in humans, about 2 to 4 millimeters thick. The cerebral cortex contains many cells. When you look at it histologically, it's hypercellular. It contains several cell bodies of neurons. Among others, it will also contain neuroglial cells. So it's hypercellular zone, as you can see. In as much as we defined gray matter as a collection of cell bodies of neurons, you realize that you'll still even also have axons within the gray matter. And the reason is this. Let's suppose that we have cell bodies of neurons here. Definitely from that cell body, you must have axons that will come out of it. So yes, to some extent, then you'll also have some axons within the cortex. But definition of the cortex will not be based on the presence of axons, but presence of cell bodies of neurons. It's hypercellular. Histologically, we can describe a number of layers of the cerebral cortex. There are those layers that have particular types of cells more predominant than other types of cells. And so historically, the cerebral cortex has been described in terms of 6 histological layers, from superficial to deep. Layer 1 is what we call the molecular layer. The molecular layer corresponds with around this region here, histologically. Well, let me just mention that these layers are not well defined. They're not well distinct from one to another. But as you move from superficial going deep, then you realize that definitely something changing. So molecular layer is the most superficial zone. The molecular layer is a dendritic zone. It's more of a region where we have dendritic synapsing. So molecular layer is a synaptic zone, mainly a lot of dendrites of neurons meeting here. Layer 2, which we call the external granular layer. The external granular layer forms the forms the input center from other cortices. Now, what I mean is this. If a neuron is coming from another cortical region, that neuron will most likely terminate in layer 2. So it's an input center for neurons arising from other cortical regions. That means that it's an input center for association fibers as well as for commissural fibers, because those are the ones which come from other cortical regions. On the other hand, layer 3, which we call the external pyramidal layer, the layer 3, which we are calling external pyramidal layer, contain pyramidal cells as the name suggests. Pyramidal cells are just types of neurons. Layer 3 give rise to association and commissural fibers. So what am I saying? If the cell bodies of neurons here are of association fibers and commissural fibers, let's assume they're association fibers. So the cell body will come from layer 3 in a particular cortical region. Then that axon will go and terminate in layer 2 of another cortical region. That's how it works. Or if it is for commissural fiber, it will come from layer 3 in one side of the cortex, then cross the midline and terminate in layer 2 on the opposite side of the brain. So that layer 3 becomes an output center for commissural and association fibers. Layer 2 is an input center for the same type of fibers, commissural and association fibers. Layer 4 is called the internal granular layer. The inner granular layer is the cortical input center. What does that mean? It means that the fibers which come from outside the cerebral cortex terminate in layer 4. All the fibers, ideally, almost all the fibers which come from regions outside the cerebral cortex terminate in layer 4. Now, primarily, these neurons come from the thalamus. And so sometimes we call it the thalamic input center. Most of those neurons will be coming from the thalamus and then to go to the cerebral cortex. I think I mentioned that concept sometime back during the introduction where I told you that sensations, when they go to the cerebral cortex, they do not really go directly. We have first order sensory neurons, second order sensory neuron, third order sensory neuron. Third order sensory neurons come from the thalamus to the cortex. This is the layer of the cortex where the third order sensory neurons terminate, what we call the Thalamocortical projections. They project to the layer 4 of the cerebral cortex. Layer 5 of the, so layer 4 is the input center for projection fibers, so to speak. Layer 5 is what you're calling inner pyramidal layer. The inner pyramidal layer gives rise to projection fibers. So the cell bodies of projection fibers are located within layer 5. Layer 5 is the one that gives you neurons that come out of the cerebral cortex to go to other subcortical regions. Layer 6 is a mixed region called the multiform layer. It's a transition between the cortex and the white matter. It's a transition zone with many mixtures of cells, no specific function. It's just a transition zone. So these are the histological layers of the cerebral cortex. I have a question for you. You'll answer it on the poll. Let me launch that for you. So you have it with you and you have 1 minute. So your time is up. Click the button quickly. It's over now. I'm sharing with you your results. And to my surprise, nobody has gotten the correct response. Not even one. So you now know the answer, because there's only one response there that nobody has chosen. We did this, so I'll not go back to it. So let's proceed. So in this lecture on the cerebral cortex, what do we want to know? The first objective we've already clarified, to talk about the microscopic structure of the cerebral cortex. The second objective is to identify the major gyri in each of the lobes of the cerebral cortex. And for those gyri that we identify, we are going to give names to the cortices that those gyri house. The cortices are named according to their function. So we are going to give names to those cortical regions which are housed by the gyri, and we are going to state the role of each of those cortical regions. There's someone called Brodmann who was a neuroanatomist from Germany. Brodmann studied the cerebral cortex and described different functions for different cortical regions. He unfortunately chose to give them numbers as well. And so there's a concept called Brodmann's numbers. As we do the functional areas, we will be linking them to the Brodmann numbers. There are quite many. We'll not even do a third of them, I can assure you that. But we will pick the major ones. There are about 52 cortical regions. We'll just highlight on the key ones. And that's why I'm using the term major functional areas. So I'll not bore you with taking you through all the 52 regions. It is not within your scope, but at least we'll highlight on the functional regions which are important for you to know. The ones that will help you also to make a diagnosis on a patient. And because we are clinicians, we also try to work out the clinical presentations of our patients if they have lesions on those specific cortical regions that we're going to talk about. At the tail end of the session, we look at the blood supply to the brain and specifically to the cerebral cortex. And we'll try to link this blood supply with various vascular syndromes that can occur in case any of these vessels are occluded in what we usually call stroke. So when you talk of functional localization of the cerebral cortex, you see this image here giving you names to the different gyri and sulci. And I can assure you again that this is not everything. Actually, the ones labeled here are fewer than the ones which are not been labeled. The gyri are all named. The sulci are all named. I'll not take you through the names of all the sulci, and I'll give you names of a few gyri. But the objective here is to do this, that for each of the lobes that we've talked about, which means frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe, for each of the lobes, we are going to name some specific gyri. So we'll name a number of gyrus in each lobe. For each gyrus that we label, we are going to give the name of the cortex that gyrus houses. Now, the cortical area that we are focusing on is a cortical area with a defined function. So I'm giving that cortical functional area. Those cortical functional areas have a number, and where possible, I'll give you the Brodmann's number. I've told you they are between 1 to 52. Then importantly, of course, we'll state the role of that cortical functional area. What role does it do? And tailored to that, we'll then look at the effects of injuring such a specific region. So this is our scope. This is our intention. Just to make you salivate a bit, we look at the brain and we see several numbers. Those are examples of the Brodmann's numbers. Now you realize that there's no specific pattern that you can follow and say this is number 1, 2, then you go in a particular order. No, there's no particular order. I want us to pick this by looking at each of the lobes, and I prefer starting with the frontal lobe. I'm going to name for you some gyri in the frontal lobe. So let's focus on the left image. This is the frontal lobe. This is lateral sulcus, or others called Sylvian fissure. This is the central sulcus, or others called Rolandic sulcus. So this is the frontal lobe. Now look, if this is the central sulcus, we can see that there's another sulcus that's running almost parallel to it, but anterior to it. I'll try as much as possible to ignore the names of the sulci so that the disk space remaining in your head will be adequate enough to absorb the names of the gyri. So at least Rolandic sulcus have given you the name, central sulcus. There's another sulcus running anterior to it and parallel to it. If you introduce a sulcus there, then it means we define a gyrus here. This gyrus is known as the Pre-Central Gyrus. Okay, so put that somewhere in your head, that the frontal lobe has a Pre-Central Gyrus. Also, I want you to see that there are two sulci here. So that one and this other one. Again, I'm avoiding their names. But if I put a sulcus there, and I put a sulcus here, I am dividing the frontal lobe, or the rest of the frontal lobe, into 3 regions. The one above is superior frontal gyrus. The one in the middle, which is convoluting like this, is the middle frontal gyrus. And the one below, again convoluting like that, is the inferior frontal gyrus. So that there are three frontal gyri at this level: superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. So now we can say we've mentioned 4 gyri so far. Now look at the 3 gyri. And I want you to notice that they seem to converge somewhere anteriorly. The anterior region where they seem to converge has a specific name. Let's call it the frontal pole. So that's the frontal pole. Okay, now that is the lateral surface of the brain. We've looked at the gyri on the frontal lobe from the lateral surface of the brain. How about if you were to look at it from the medial aspect of the hemisphere? On the medial aspect of the hemisphere, so this is corpus callosum. This is the frontal lobe, maybe up to somewhere there. So this one here is in the frontal lobe. This gyrus has a name, this one here. We call it the medial frontal gyrus. Medial frontal gyrus. And the one below, this one here, is called cingulate gyrus. Now, of importance to note is that cingulate gyrus seems to extend beyond even the frontal lobe. Cingulate gyrus is even in the parietal lobe, and we see that it's even extending down a part of it, continuing into another gyrus in the temporal lobe down. So we will not talk about cingulate gyrus at this point. We'll mention it later in another unique system, of course, towards the end of this lecture. So the gyri that I've named for you in the frontal lobe are Pre-Central Gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, frontal pole, and medial frontal gyrus. Those are not the only gyri in the frontal lobe, but those are the gyri that I want to talk about in terms of functional localization, and so they're the ones I've picked for you. So let's do this. We agreed that we are going to name gyri. We are going to give names to the cortical functional area. We are going to give a Brodmann number. We are going to state the role of that area, and we are going to state the effect of injury in such a region. One of the gyri that we've named is the Pre-Central Gyrus. We've also mentioned inferior frontal gyrus, and we've mentioned frontal pole. Let's start with these 3 first. Now, for Pre-Central Gyrus, the cortex that is housed by the Pre-Central Gyrus is known as the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is area number 4 of the cerebral cortex. The role of this region is to initiate voluntary movements. Remember, when you talk of voluntary movements, you're particularly referring to innervation to skeletal muscles. So this is the part of the cerebral cortex that initiate voluntary movements, which control basically skeletal muscles. Therefore, if the primary motor cortex is injured, someone will be paralyzed. But we know that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. You have the right and the left precentral gyri. If you injure the right precentral gyri, you then affect the muscles of the left side of the body. And if you injure the left precentral gyrus, then you affect the muscles on the right side of the body. And now the concept is that you don't affect all the muscles of the body, you affect one side predominantly. This concept of paralyzing the opposite half of the muscles of the body is the one we are calling contralateral hemiplegia. Contralateral means that it's opposite side, as opposed to ipsilateral, which means the same side. We define those terms on our introductory lecture. So we get contralateral. Hemiplegia means half, paralysis of one half. Hemi is half, plegia is paralysis. So the half that you're paralyzing is the opposite half. That's the concept of contralateral hemiplegia. The other gyrus in the frontal lobe is the inferior frontal gyrus. Inferior frontal gyrus houses a cortical region that we are calling the Broca's area. That is with respect to the name of the person who described the area. The Broca's area is area number 45 and area number 44. It is within the inferior frontal gyrus. This area is the one that we use to articulate, the one that we use to express ourselves verbally, the one we use for talking. We call that motor speech. Motor speech is basically talking. And therefore, if this area is injured, then you wouldn't expect your patient to present themselves, to express themselves in words. They cannot talk. That's what we call expressive aphasia. You can call it motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia. In simple terms, your patients cannot talk. Now you need to understand that speech has multiple aspects. There's the talking part of speech, which we call motor speech. There is the hearing part of speech, which we call auditory speech. And there is the understanding part of speech, which we call sensory speech. So when you talk of Broca's area, we are particularly talking about motor speech, the talking part of speech. We are not talking about the hearing part of speech, neither are we talking about the understanding part of speech. Those three speech regions are all represented in the cerebral cortex in different regions. Broca's cortex only houses the motor speech area. The frontal pole houses a cortical region that we prefer calling the prefrontal cortex. We call it prefrontal cortex because it's the most anterior part of the frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex houses Brodmann's area number 9, 10, 11, and 12. The prefrontal cortex is important as a higher cognitive function center. It's a center for higher cognitive functions. When you talk of cognitive functions, we are talking about these unique functions such as thinking, reasoning, intelligence, memory, judgment, calculation, those intellectual things. Anything nice, put it there. Those are cognitive functions. And so this is the region of the brain that is responsible for cognitive functions. If you injure this region, we are going to then impair cognitive functions. Maybe one thing to note in these three regions you've talked about, the cognitive area is housed in both hemispheres. The right hemisphere has cognitive functions, the left hemisphere has cognitive functions. So if you injure one cognitive area, one side, you don't necessarily abolish cognitive functions, you just impair them. However, for the Broca's cortex is only on one side of the hemisphere. It is only present on the dominant hemisphere. The term dominant hemisphere is a common term you'll be coming across in neuroanatomy. It simply refers to the fact that there's one hemisphere that has some functions that dominate over the other. And in simple terms, if you are right-handed, then your dominant hemisphere is the left one. And most likely, if you are left-handed, then you are having a right hemispheric dominance. So those handedness also go with these other functions. If I am right-handed, my left hemisphere is the one that's dominant. Therefore, the Broca's cortex is only housed on the left hemisphere. Broca's area is only on the dominant hemisphere, but the prefrontal area, well, even primary motor area, are housed on both hemispheres. So I came to that because I want to tell you that if you injure one side of the prefrontal cortex, you don't really abolish cognitive functions. And that's why I use the term impair cognitive functions rather than abolish. But if you injure motor speech area, you can actually abolish this role. Okay, we are still going on with the frontal lobe. We've talked about the Pre-Central Gyrus, the inferior frontal gyrus, and the frontal pole. I want us to talk about superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and medial frontal gyrus. So here we are. Let's begin the middle frontal gyrus. The middle frontal gyrus houses the cortical region that we call the frontal eye field, Brodmann's area number 8. The frontal eye field is responsible for what we call horizontal conjugate gaze. Horizontal conjugate gaze is the ability of both eyes to move simultaneously within the same horizontal plane. For example, if you fix your head on something and you want to see what is happening in your environment without necessarily the people you're looking at know that you're looking at them, then you may want to turn one of your eyes to the opposite side and the other one need to follow. For example, you can look at my eyes on the screen. So I might have to do this, something like that, or something like that. Both eyes need to move simultaneously within the same horizontal plane if you're going to focus on a particular object. The ability of both eyes to move simultaneously within the same horizontal plane is alluded to the role of the frontal eye field, Brodmann's area number 8. It therefore goes without saying that if you have injury to this region, then you'll not be able to move both eyes simultaneously within the same horizontal plane. Now, the implication is this, that maybe one eye will lag behind as the other one moves. Such a person will not be able to focus on one particular object because the eyes will be perhaps focusing on different objects. Therefore, what will be registered in this person is two objects. He'll be seeing things in twos, and that is what we call double vision. Medically, we call it diplopia. Superior frontal gyrus houses a region we're calling the pre-motor cortex. This is Brodmann's area number 6. The pre-motor cortex control voluntary movements. It controls voluntary movements, just like the primary motor cortex. The premotor cortex is sometimes called the secondary motor cortex. It controls voluntary movement, just like the primary motor cortex, and therefore, if you injure the premotor cortex, you're also going to affect muscles of the opposite side of the body. There'll be paralysis. We call that contralateral hemiplegia, as we had called it before. The medial frontal gyrus houses another region we are calling the supplementary motor area. This is area number 24 of the cerebral cortex. Supplementary motor area is also concerned with the voluntary movements. But in this case, there are these movements that have a temporal aspect to them, to mean that the movements are time dependent. For example, if you're riding a bicycle, you know that after stepping with one foot, now the other one needs to step, then another one, in a sequential manner. You don't step both feet at the same time. That's what I mean. These movements which have a temporal aspect, they have a temporal sequence to them. The supplementary motor area is therefore also concerned with movements. Therefore, if it's injured, you still get paralysis of the opposite half of the body. Great, so I've given you 6 gyri in the frontal cortex, in as much as the number of gyri in the frontal cortex are perhaps over 10. I've just picked those ones and I've given their role. That means that we've not really exhausted functions of the frontal cortex, but I've chosen to give you those ones which I think at least you need to know based on your level of training. All right, so we can make a summary of the key functions of the frontal cortex. One of the key functions of the frontal cortex is to control voluntary movement. We've seen that. And there are many regions of the frontal cortex that actually do control voluntary movements. The Precentral Gyrus, which is primary motor cortex. Premotor area, which is on the superior frontal gyrus. Frontal eye field, which is within the middle frontal gyrus. Supplementary motor area, which is on the medial frontal gyrus. All those regions control voluntary movement. Therefore, if you injure frontal cortex, you're going to paralyze the muscle these regions control. The second major function of the frontal cortex is expressive speech, motor speech, the talking part of speech. This is the speech region here, housed within the inferior frontal gyrus. We've called the region the Broca's area, area number 45 and area number 44. The third key function of the frontal cortex is cognitive functions. Cognitive functions is housed in the prefrontal cortex within the frontal pole, area number 9, area number 10, area number 11. 12 is not visible from this view, it's medial, but you can also add here area number 46. All that is the prefrontal cortex for cognitive functions. Great, so I want to leave it there for the frontal cortex and move to another cortex, the parietal cortex. So the parietal lobe. Look at this one. This is the central sulcus. And so the lobe behind the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. I'll mention two key gyri, or rather three key gyri within the parietal lobe. There's a sulcus here. That sulcus helps us define a gyrus here. The gyrus is behind the central sulcus, so we can call it post-central gyrus. Don't confuse post-central gyrus with pre-central gyrus. This is beyond, this is before the central sulcus. So the one beyond the central sulcus is called post-central gyrus. That one will be in the parietal cortex. The one before the central sulcus is called pre-central gyrus. That is in the frontal cortex. So we're talking about the post-central gyrus. Then there's this sulcus here that divides the rest of the parietal lobe into two. There's a gyrus above and another one below. The one above is called superior parietal lobule, and the one below is called the inferior parietal lobule. So we mentioned post-central gyrus, superior parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule. Look at the inferior parietal lobule. The inferior parietal lobule seems to have two other gyri within it. The one anterior to, in the anterior aspect, almost related to the lateral sulcus, is called the supramarginal gyrus. Then the one behind it is what we are calling the angular gyrus. Supramarginal and angular gyri are part of the inferior parietal lobe. Okay, so let's focus on the gyri in the parietal cortex. We've talked of post-central gyrus. Post-central gyrus represent what we call the primary somatosensory cortex. That's the name of the functional region, the functional cortical area. Primary somatosensory cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex is area, Brodmann's area number 3, 1, and 2. This region of the cerebral cortex is the one that is responsible for perception of general sensations. We clarified that when you talk of general sensations, we mean things like pain, temperature, touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception. They are perceived on this region of the brain. Therefore, if you injure the post-central gyrus, a patient will not be able to perceive the general sensations. The term given to loss of sensation is anesthesia. But on which side will they lose the sensation? If you injure the left precentral gyrus, they will not perceive sensations from the right side of the body, because sensations on the right of the body are the ones that terminate on the left post-central gyrus. Sensations from the right side of the body terminate on the left post-central gyrus. So if you injure the left post-central gyrus, you'll affect sensations from the right side of the body. If you injure the right post-central gyrus, you affect sensation from the left side of the body. You get contralateral sensory loss. Linked to that one is the superior parietal lobule, which represents the secondary somatosensory cortex, area number 5 and 7. The secondary somatosensory cortex is for recognition of general sensations. We use this region to recognize sensations. Now, you need to understand the difference between perception of a sensation, which is the role of a primary region, and recognition of a sensation, which is the role of a secondary region. And it doesn't matter which type of sensation. Any sensory cortex, not necessarily somatosensory, any sensation, whether it's spatial or general, will have a primary region for perception and a secondary region for recognition. To recognize means to identify. You can only identify what you already know. Therefore, for you to recognize, you need memory. See, if I touch a hard thing on my hand, let's say that hard thing is this one I'm showing you on the screen. My primary somatosensory area will tell me that I've touched a hard thing. But my secondary somatosensory area will associate that hard thing I'm holding with memory and identify it as a phone. So a secondary sensory area is for recognition, to identify the sensations. For you to identify, you need to link what you have at that point with what you already know. You need to link it with memory. Okay, so if I'm not able to recognize sensation because I have injury in the secondary somatosensory cortex, what do we call that? The term given for inability to recognize sensation is agnosia. Perhaps it's important to clarify something at this point. For secondary somatosensory cortex, it will depend on which hemisphere is actually affected. Generally, the dominant hemisphere tends to help us recognize sensations from the environment, environmental sensations. So if I injure the secondary somatosensory cortex on the dominant hemisphere, then I'll not be able to recognize environmental sensations. However, the non-dominant hemisphere tend to recognize self, to identify yourself. And what does that mean if it's injured then? If you injure the non-dominant hemisphere, if you injure the secondary somatosensory area on the non-dominant hemisphere, then the individual will not be able to recognize self. They will think that this part of the body is not theirs, so to speak. Now you realize we are bordering on something that could be psychiatric at this point. But that's what it is. We call that syndrome self-neglect syndrome. They tend to ignore some part of their body. So you can assume that your right foot is yours and your left foot is not yours, something like that. Perhaps it becomes more dramatic, therefore, when this person needs to dress themselves, unless it's trouser. So they can put on trouser on one side of the leg, but the other one is not there, so they're not putting on. Very dramatic clinical manifestations, self-neglect syndrome, injury to the non-dominant secondary somatosensory cortex. Supramarginal gyri and angular gyri are part of the inferior parietal lobule. These two regions represent a unique region in the brain called the Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is area number 39 and area number 40. This is the region responsible for sensory speech. Sensory speech is the ability to understand language. It is both written language as well as spoken language. The ability to understand language is sensory speech. It has to be a language that you already know. I can't start here speaking Chinese, then you don't understand, then I say you have Wernicke's injury. It has to be a language that you already know. So that language that you already know, we can converse, you should be able to understand me. That ability to understand language is what you're calling sensory speech. The Wernicke's cortex extends partially into the temporal cortex. So there's some part of Wernicke's area still on the temporal cortex, but a bigger part is in the parietal cortex. If you injure Wernicke's cortex, therefore, you expect this patient not to be able to understand what they are saying or understand what they're being told, understand what they are reading. They'll have what you call receptive aphasia. They cannot understand what they are saying, what they're being told, what they are reading. Someone mentioned of the presence of insular region, and I told you that insular region is hidden within the lateral sulcus. But the regions of the parietal cortex adjacent to the insular region, I want to call that parainsular region. The regions of the parietal cortex adjacent to the insular region. Well, the term parainsular does not really limit us to the parietal cortex, but we are talking about parietal cortex at this point. So the regions of the parietal cortex adjacent to the insular region is what we call the parainsular region. Parainsular region represents the primary gustatory cortex. Gustation is a term given for taste. So this is the primary taste area, area number 43 of the brain. The primary taste area is responsible for perception of taste sensation. So therefore, if this area is injured, then the patient will not be able to perceive taste sensation. Good. These are the regions within the parietal cortex that I wanted to highlight on. We can make a summary of the key functions of the parietal cortex, and your guess should be as good as mine when you say that the parietal cortex has one key role: perception and recognition of all sensations, except the sensation of smell, hearing, and vision. You realize that we've actually talked about all sensations being either perceived within the parietal cortex or being recognized within the parietal cortex. The only sensations we've not talked about is the sensation of smell, sensation of hearing, and sensation of vision, sight. If you remember, this is the post-central gyrus where we perceive sensations. This is the superior parietal lobule where we recognize general sensations. This is the inferior parietal lobule where is the speech area, which is the second key function of the parietal cortex, sensory speech, Wernicke's area here. Then I've told you that if you open the sulcus, the parts of the parietal cortex adjacent to the sulcus is the parainsular region, the region responsible for taste, which is still sensation. Right, so that is parietal cortex. Now I want to say something that cuts across parietal cortex as well as frontal cortex with emphasis on the pre and the post central gyrus. If you look at this brain, we're looking at the brain from the top. So the gyrus in front of the central sulcus is Pre-Central Gyrus for the right and the left side of the brain. The one, we can call it blue, I think, is the Post-Central Gyrus for the left and the right hemisphere. We've mentioned that the Precentral Gyrus is a primary motor cortex, and that the Post-Central Gyrus is a primary somatosensory cortex. So the implication is that the Pre-Motor Cortex, the Pre-Central Gyrus control skeletal muscles to initiate movements, and Post-Central Gyrus perceive sensations from different parts of the body. Now, the body is not randomly represented on the cerebral cortex. There's a particular pattern in which the body is represented on these two gyri. And the map you're seeing is a map of how the body is represented on those two gyri. The surface area of representation is not directly proportional to the size of the body being represented. There's some regions that have a very big cortical representation in as much as they're very small. Look at the surface area representing the hand. And look at the surface representing the thumb. So big. Compare that with the region representing the trunk. See, this is the trunk. It's even smaller than what the hand represents. Now, this graphic or topographic representation of the body on the cerebral cortex is what we call the homunculus. Now, I want you to see the graph of the homunculus nicely. If we take this to be the coronal section of the brain, the blue one is focusing on this one, and this other color is focusing on this one. You notice that the body is represented in such a way that the lower limbs are on the medial aspect of the hemisphere. The waist region is somewhere at that corner. Then the upper part of the body are on the lateral aspect, with the head region being much lower down here. The region of the tongue is almost even hidden. And so it makes sense why we say that the test area is actually parainsular. Now, this is the insular lobe. This one here is the insular lobe. That cortex that is deep to the lateral sulcus, because this is parietal, this is temporal, this is insular lobe. So this region of the parietal cortex adjacent to insula is what we've called the parainsular. For motor and for sensory, the body is topographically represented on the cerebral cortex in this manner. The lower limbs are on the medial aspect. The upper parts of the body are on lateral aspect. Assume that person is just lying like that. But important to remember is that the surface represented here is not directly proportional to the actual body surface. This is largely based on function. We need a lot of control for the muscles on the face. We need a lot of control for the muscles of the hand, much more than we need control for the muscles of the waist. That is what we call the homunculus. And you need to remember this because if you're going to interpret some stroke syndromes, then you need to remember this. If I injure the Precentral Gyrus at this point, I will not paralyze the whole body. Perhaps I'll only paralyze the muscles in the upper part of the body or in the face. But if I injure Precentral Gyrus at this point, I'll paralyze perhaps the muscles around the waist. That's the whole concept. And you need to get it right that those cortical regions are the ones that are either receiving sensations going in for the Postcentral Gyrus or giving rise to neurons which come out to go to muscles. For example, if we look at the Pre-Central Gyrus, let's assume this is a Pre-Central Gyrus. It's the one giving us neurons which go to muscles. In our introduction, we said that the efferent division of the nervous system consists of a relay of two neurons. The neuron that comes from the cerebral cortex is called the upper motor neuron. The neuron that comes from either the brainstem or spinal nerve or spinal cord is called the lower motor neuron. So the Pre-Central Gyrus actually gives us the upper motor neurons. Upper motor neurons which go to muscles usually can either come from the cerebral cortex or they can come from some regions below the cerebral cortex. We'll be talking about those ones later. But the ones that come from the cerebral cortex go direct to either the brainstem or to spinal cord. But you'll remember they also decassate at some point. And that is why this side of the brain will then control the muscles of this side of the body. And this side of the brain will control the muscles of this other side of the body. Because the upper motor neurons also decassate, and you can see the decassation there. To decassate is to cross over. Similar for sensations, we agree that for sensations to go to the brain, it is a relay of three neurons. There's a neuron that comes in, first order sensory neuron, it terminates in the spinal cord or it may terminate in the brainstem. Then we have a second order sensory neuron which decassettes and climb all the way to the thalamus. Then we have a third order neuron that terminates now in the post-central gyrus. So that synapsing onto the post-central gyrus will be based on the region. The ones that come from the lower limb will most likely terminate somewhere there. The ones that come from the upper limb will most likely terminate somewhere there. The ones that come from the head region will most likely terminate somewhere there, according to the homunculus pattern. Same thing here for the pre-central gyrus. The neurons which go to the lower limb will most likely arise from somewhere here, medial aspect. The neurons which go to the head region will most likely arise from somewhere here. So remember the concept of homunculus. It is applied to the pre-central gyrus as well as the post-central gyrus, a very important concept. Let's look at the third lobe. The third lobe you're going to look at is the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe is not that complicated. From the lateral aspect, this is the occipital lobe. The demarcations of the occipital lobe are not very clear if you look at the brain from the lateral aspect, but you can see something called the pre-occipital notch there. There's usually that notch, and you can see another notch here. We call that the parietal occipital notch. So you join that notch with this notch with imaginary line for you to demarcate the occipital lobe from the rest of the other lobes, namely parietal and temporal. But a better way of distinguishing the Occipital lobe is looking at it from the medial aspect, like in this case. There's a big sulcus there, which we call the parietal occipital sulcus. It is this parietal occipital sulcus that we are looking at on this other end, and we see it as a notch. Here, it's a big sulcus. So this is the occipital lobe. So which gyri do I want you to know in the occipital lobe? First, look at this other sulcus. Now, this one I want you to remember the name. There's this sulcus that goes through the occipital lobe. This sulcus is called the Calcarine Sulcus. That's the spelling of the Calcarine Sulcus. From the lateral view, it's not dominant so much, but medially, it's a big thing. So I want you to remember Calcarine Sulcus. Calcarine sulcus tends to divide the occipital lobe into two major gyri. The gyrus above is called the cuneus gyrus. You'll see the spelling in the next slide. The gyrus below is called the lingual gyrus. So cuneal gyrus and lingual gyrus. Those are the only ones I want you to know in the occipital lobe. But I want you also to note that the calcarine sulcus is extending from here all the way to the occipital pole. This is the occipital pole. Okay, so let's mention them. In terms of gyrus, this is what I want you to remember. The banks of calcarine sulcus is an important region in as much as it's not a distinct gyrus. You know, banks like river bank. So let's put that as a specific gyro region in quotes. The banks of calcarine sulcus constitute what we call the primary visual cortex. This is area number 17, according to Brodmann. The primary visual cortex is the region we use for perception of light. So the visual inputs terminate in the primary visual cortex. Therefore, if you injure this region, you'll expect somebody not to be able to see objects. Loss of vision is what you're calling anopia. I know you want to call it blindness, it's fine, but let's call it anopia for medical reasons. Simply means loss of vision. You know, it doesn't have to be complete anopia, which you call blindness. The cuneal gyrus and the lingual gyrus represent visual association cortices. The term association is the other term we can use for secondary, except that for vision, we usually have secondary as well as tertiary vision. I don't want to go to the distinction between secondary and tertiary vision. And so I prefer to use the term association cortex. And basically, an association cortex is for recognition. The reason why we use the term association for secondary sensory cortices is because a secondary sensory cortex will be able to associate the sensation at that point with memory, and that is what you use for recognition. And so secondary association cortices are visual association cortices, area number 18 and 19. They are for recognition of light inputs. So this is what you'll use to recognize faces of people that you've met before. Like I know you've not met me physically, you know, because of this online thing. So sometimes we meet on the street. We may meet on the street and you like, hey, where I have seen this face before. You'll be using your secondary visual cortex to be able to remember my face or something. Okay, maybe a better way is someone you've met before, maybe in high school, you used to be together. You meet them again in the street and you say, this is so-and-so, because you've remembered their face. You're able to recognize them. And ideally it should be in that context of people that you're able to remember or objects you're able to remember. Now, we're not talking about someone you met in class 1, then you're not be able to identify them right now, then you say, oh, I'm sick. It should be the context of people we actually do expect that to remember. Like if you're married now, your wife or husband, or okay, maybe the category here, maybe the example that will apply is boyfriend, girlfriend. So if you meet your boyfriend, you should be able to recognize them. Now you can imagine if you then have injury of this region, it means that you can't recognize faces, and that's what we call visual agnosia, inability to recognize faces, inability to recognize objects is what we call visual agnosia. It might sound very light, but assume this is your boyfriend. He comes home and you're not able to recognize them because you're sick. And then now maybe they talk and you're able to recognize them because the region for recognizing voice is okay. Visual agnosia can be very frustrating if you cannot recognize faces of people. All right, that's occipital. So if you are to say one thing, the key function of the occipital cortex, then we say the occipital cortex is for perception and recognition of visual inputs. Vision is the role of the occipital cortex. Let's now look at the final cortex, the temporal lobe. So just a preview of the temporal lobe. On your left, we are looking at the temporal lobe from a lateral aspect. We see 3 gyri, that one, and that one. Let's call them superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. They're just running parallel like that. And here we still see them superior, middle, and the inferior one is a bit not so well visualized here. But this is the superior temporal, middle temporal, and inferior temporal gyri. Now, if this part of the parietal and frontal lobes are removed, it will enable you to see the insular lobe, which is labeled 1, 2, 3 there. Not 4, but at least 1, 2, 3 there. This is insular lobe, because we've removed the frontal and parietal regions that overlap the lateral sulcus. But something else I want you to see. Look at this gyri, which arise from the superior temporal gyrus, the one labeled 4. That gyrus has a specific name, and it's an important one, so I want you to remember it. It's running transversely. If you are to understand this in 3D, those gyri will be running transversely. So we call them the transverse temporal gyri. So I've mentioned, in addition to the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, inferior temporal gyrus, I've mentioned the transverse temporal gyri. Now, this is when we look at the temporal lobe from the lateral aspect. How about if you look at the temporal lobe from the medial aspect of the hemisphere? 2 other gyri we'll see. There's this one here, which we call the parahippocampus, or the parahippocampal gyrus. Parahippocampal gyrus, followed well, will extend into this gyrus, which we called earlier on the cingulate gyrus. This is called cingulate gyrus, not in the temporal lobe definitely, but it usually continues. That continuation is not well here. Assume there's a continuation here into the parahippocampal gyrus. The anterior part of the parahippocampal gyrus, around this region, is what we call the uncus. U-N-C-U-S, uncus. Okay, deep to the parahippocampal gyrus, there's another one now called the now called the hippocampus. This is the hippocampus here. I know I've mentioned many things, but I want those terms to ring a bell in your head. The ones I want you to remember at least. Remember the term parahippocampus. Remember the term hippocampus. Remember the term uncus, which is the anterior part of parahippocampus. Then on the lateral side, I want to remember two things. The superior temporal gyrus and the transverse temporal gyrus. You can ignore the middle and the inferior temporal gyrus. So let's start with the transverse temporal gyri. The transverse temporal gyri is also called the transverse gyri of Herschel. Transverse temporal gyri of Herschel. The person who described it is called Herschel. That's the spelling of Herschel. The transverse temporal gyri of Herschel represents the primary auditory cortex, area number 41 and 42. The primary auditory cortex is for perception of sound. We have now looked at the third primary region concerned with speech. We've looked at the Broca's cortex for motor speech, Wernicke's region for sensory speech, and now we've mentioned the primary auditory cortex for auditory speech. So therefore, this is the region of the brain that we use for hearing, for perception of sound, hearing. So if it's injured, then you get a hearing loss. There are usually two types of hearing loss. Someone may not hear because there's a problem with how sound is being conducted in their ear. We call that conduction hearing loss. But someone also may not hear because there's a problem with the neuronal signal as well as the sensory organ for hearing. And that is what we call sensory neuron hearing loss. So if the injury is in the cortex, then definitely you are affecting the neuronal circuit of hearing. And that is why we are calling sensory neuron hearing loss as opposed to conduction hearing loss. Conduction hearing loss would be caused by, let's say, maybe there's wax in your ear or something has perforated the eardrum or the bones in the ear have an issue. That would be a problem with the conduction. That one largely happens in the outer and the middle ear. From the inner ear inwards up to the brain, if you have a problem there, then you get sensory neuron hearing loss. Superior temporal gyrus is the secondary auditory cortex, which is area number 2 to 22. As we had mentioned earlier, primary region is for perception, secondary region is for recognition. And I clarified to you that a secondary auditory cortex can therefore also be called an auditory association cortex. The term association is also used to mean secondary. The reason why we call it association is because you're associating a sensation you have that point in time with memory, what you already know, so that you're able to recognize. Therefore, if you injure the superior temporal gyrus, then you'll not be able to recognize sounds. And that is what we call auditory agnosia, inability to recognize sound. Now, what do you need to recognize sound? You need to have known that sound before. So if an animal meows, then you say that's a dog, then it means there's a problem. You should be able to understand that meow is a cat because you've already known the sound of cats. I'm making that assumption. Okay, the other region that I want to talk about, I didn't mention it, is the Piriform Lobe. The Piriform Lobe is still part of the Temporal Lobe. It is the region represented by the uncus and the anterior parts of parahippocampus. The uncus and the anterior parts of parahippocampus, we call that the Piriform Lobe. The Piriform Lobe is the primary olfactory cortex. The uncus is specifically is area number 34. And some parts of the parahippocampus represent area number 28. The primary olfactory cortex is the region that we use for perception of smell. Therefore, if you injure the piriform lobe, then you lose the perception of smell. Loss of sense of smell is what you are calling anosmia. Loss of sense of smell is anosmia. Great. There's one more thing that I want to talk about in the temporal lobe, and that thing is what we call the limbic system. What are we calling the limbic system? Or some people will call the limbic lobe. The limbic system refers to some structures that border the cerebral hilum. These structures have a link with expression of emotions. The term limbic here does not refer to the limbs. The term limbic here is a Greek term which means bordering or edging. They border the cerebral hilum. The cerebral hilum is this region here where the right and the left hemisphere are joined together. The region around the diencephalon and corpus callosum. So the structures around that hilum have been shown to have a link with expression of emotions. Those structures constitute the limbic system. A number of these structures are housed within the temporal lobe, and that is why we are mentioning the limbic system in the temporal lobe. But in real sense, these structures actually traverse all the 4 lobes of the brain. So which structures specifically within the temporal lobe have limbic function? We've mentioned this one. That is the parahippocampus. This big one is the parahippocampus. We've mentioned this one. That is the hippocampus. There's something between the two. If you have a small screen, you might not see it nicely. If you have a big screen, you might see it nicely or vaguely. But there's that thing there. In that groove, there's something hidden there. Usually, there's a gyrus inside there, which look like teeth. We call it dentate gyrus. I am just telling you a tip of an iceberg when you're talking about the limbic system. There are many structures within this region that are limbic, and you'll be seeing that shortly. But these ones, I want you to remember the major parts of the limbic system that are within the temporal lobe: dentate gyrus, hippocampus, and parahippocampus. Limbic system, however, is not limited to the temporal lobe. There's some parts of the limbic system which are not within the temporal lobe. Again, there are many, but I can mention a few. We've mentioned hypothalamus before. I think if you haven't, we'll mention today, but you've heard about it. Cingulate gyrus is this one here. cingulate gyrus is part of the limbic system. You can see it's also bordering or edging. This one here, this thing here, that is curving like that, that is what we call the fornix. Fornix is also part of the limbic system. This big mass here is a thalamus. There are some parts of the thalamus which are part of the limbic system. The same way there are some parts of the hypothalamus which are part of the limbic system. Again, this is just a tip of an iceberg with regard to components of the limbic system which are outside the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is used to show you the thalamus, and this is the hypothalamus. This is the fornix. This is the cingulate gyrus. Continuing into some part of the parahippocampus there. Here we have a brainstem intact, so that's why you cannot see the other parts of the temporal lobe from medial view, but that's the anchors basically. Okay, so this shows you more components of the limbic system. And you agree with me, there are many components of the limbic system. All these are components of the limbic system around the cerebral hilum. Now, I don't want to teach you any of them apart from the ones that I've mentioned. But at least you can see the dentate gyrus now nicely. It's a gyrus that is having appearance of teeth. That's why it's called dentate gyrus. So back to the definition, there are structures around the cerebral hilum that have a link with emotional expression. Those are the components of the limbic system. So what are the functions of the limbic system? Apart from those emotional responses, the limbic system has other functions. What are these other functions? The limbic system controls your personality and your behavior. The limbic system also regulates food intake. So it can tell you you need to add something on your plate. It can tell you now there's no appetite. Limbic system also is important in regulating your sexual responses. It can tell you now, you need to get something. It can tell you now, you're not interested. The sexual stimuli can come from the limbic system. But also importantly, the limbic system is a center that stores short-term information. Like the things we are learning right now are being housed by the hippocampus. Now, if you don't revise, sasa shauri yako, you know why? Look at the other things which are still bugging the limbic system. If your boyfriend leaves you, your girlfriend leaves you, maybe if you didn't eat, maybe someone offended you, okay, maybe you had an orgasm, all these things will affect memory. So you need to revise so that the information you're learning today is at least transferred from the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex, the region for long-term memory. That one you'll remember when an exam comes. But ukiziacha tu hapo, if you don't revise, they remain there. They'll get choked by these other things, functions of the limbic system. Okay, that is limbic system. Now I can go back to the concept of the temporal lobe and give you a summary of the key functions of the temporal cortex. We've said that temporal cortex is a region for perception and recognition of sound. Sound is perceived on the transverse temporal gyri, area number 41 and 42. Sound is recognized on the superior temporal gyrus, area number 22. Temporal cortex is also important for olfactory functions. As we mentioned, that is what we call the Piriform Lobe, which is the primary olfactory area, area number 28 and 34, largely revolving around the anchors. then we've said that temporal lobe also has limbic functions. Because it houses most of the components of the limbic system, we are mentioning this under the temporal lobe. But the other lobes also have limbic functions. So if you ever tell me that the frontal lobe has limbic functions, I can't fail you. If you tell me that parietal lobe has limbic functions, I can't tell you. I can't fail you. Because we just seen that singular gyrus actually traverses both both frontal as well as parietal cortices. Right, so these are the key functions of the temporal cortex. I want us to look at blood supply to the brain. We've talked about cerebral cortex, but much of clinical aspects of the cerebral cortex is largely based on blood supply. And that's why I want us to talk about blood supply to the brain. It's not possible to talk about blood supply to the cerebral cortex without mentioning blood supply to the whole brain. And so let's just take this opportunity to do that. The brain receives two key sources of blood supply. There are two systems of arteries that supply the brain. One system comes from the internal carotids, and so we call that the internal carotid system. The internal carotids come from common carotid arteries. We mentioned that the right common carotid comes from brachiocephalic trunk, and the left common carotid comes direct from the arc of the aorta. That we did when we were looking at the limbs. The second source of blood supply to the brain is what we call the vertebrobasilar system. Vertebrobasilar system consists of the vertebral arteries, which come from subclavian arteries. They unite to form what we call the basilar artery, and that is what we call the vertebrobasilar system. So two systems of arteries, the vertebrobasilar system and the internal carotid system. Let's look at how these arteries interact in the brain. So let's take these two arteries shown there to be the vertebral arteries, which come from subclavian arteries. At the base of the brain, you see the vertebral arteries will enter through the foramen magnum. Then at the base of the brain, at the brainstem, the two arteries unite to form one channel, which you are calling the basilar artery. And that is why that system is therefore called the vertebrobasilar system. The vertebrobasilar system is one of the system of arteries that supply the brain, largely responsible for supplying the posterior part of the brain. And so we call the vertebrobasilar system the posterior circulation. The basilar artery terminates by dividing into two. Those two arteries are the ones we are calling the posterior cerebral arteries. And so this is the posterior circulation. Internal carotid arteries, on the other hand, are two. They come from common carotid arteries. They enter through the carotid canals. Each internal carotid artery divides into two. Those two arteries are, before these two arteries, there's a connection between the internal carotid artery and the posterior cerebral artery. That connection between the internal carotid arteries and the posterior cerebral artery is called the posterior communicating artery. We commonly call it PCOM in abbreviation for posterior communicating. The internal carotid artery then divides into two. The one labeled 6 is called the middle cerebral artery, and the one labeled 7 is called the anterior cerebral artery. The two anterior cerebral arteries also have a communication joining them. That communication is called the anterior communicating artery. You can call it ACOM. So what do we see? Internal carotid artery, which is responsible for anterior circulation, is anastomosing with the vertebrobasilar system responsible for the posterior circulation. Anastomosis is the communication between two or more vascular beds. And so look at this. We see a complete ring at the base of the skull. This complete ring of arteries at the base of the skull, at the base of the brain, is what we call the arterial circle of Willis. The arterial circle of Willis is the anastomosis of arteries at the base of the brain. Now I want you to look at that anastomosis again and tell yourself which arteries actually are within the circle of Willis. Because not all the arteries we mentioned on this list are within the circle of Willis. Look, this is the circle of Willis, this one. This is the circle of Willis. So there's some arteries which are not part of the circle of Willis, definitely. But there's some which are intrinsic part of the circle of Willis. Okay, I hope you've taken note of which arteries are within the circle of Willis, because one day I'll ask you which ones. So this system of arteries, what we call the arterial circle of Willis, it is the anastomosis between the anterior and the posterior circulation at the base of the brain. From the arterial circle of Willis, there are two types of arteries that we get. There's some arteries which are tiny. They come and they supply the deep structures. They perforate the brain to supply the deep structures. You can call them perforating arteries, or you can call them central arteries. They just tiny branches from the circle of Willis. They go deep, they supply the deep structures of the brain. Central or perforating arteries. So this would be an example of those central arteries, these ones. There are usually many all round along the circle. But there are others now which run on the surface of the brain. The ones which run on the surface of the brain to supply the cerebral cortex are called cortical arteries because they supply the cerebral cortex. The cortical arteries are three. This is one of them, anterior cerebral artery. This is the second one, middle cerebral artery. And this is the third one, posterior cerebral artery. Those are the ones that supply the cerebral cortex, and those are the ones I'm interested in at this point in time. So they run on the surface of the brain, so they supply the cerebral cortex. The anterior cerebral artery, to start with, is this one. Anterior cerebral artery runs within the longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal fissure is that cleft that separates the right and the left hemisphere. So anterior cerebral artery runs within the longitudinal fissure. You can call it the median fissure, around and above the corpus callosum. So because of that location, the anterior cerebral artery will be supplying the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It supplies the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And the territory of the anterior cerebral artery goes up to somewhere there, as you can see here. It's not the whole medial. It will not be supplying much of the occipital lobe, but at least the medial aspect of the frontal as well as parietal cortices are supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Okay. How about middle cerebral artery? Middle cerebral artery is actually the largest branch of the anterior of the internal carotid. The middle cerebral artery is part of the anterior circulation, just like the anterior cerebral artery. Middle cerebral artery runs within the lateral sulcus, and the lateral sulcus here has been exposed so that you can see the insular cortex down there. Middle cerebral artery runs within the lateral sulcus. And so with that kind of orientation, the middle cerebral artery supplies most of the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It supplies the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Well, its branches may not reach all the way to the junction there between the lateral and the medial surface, but at least a big part. And I'll be showing you a map on the territory specifically. The posterior cerebral artery is a branch of the posterior circulation as opposed to a branch of the anterior circulation. Posterior cerebral artery supplies most of the temporal lobe, especially in the medial aspect and inferior aspects, and most of the occipital lobe on the medial aspect. Temporal on the inferior aspect, and occipital on the medial aspect. That's the territory of the posterior cerebral artery. So if you are to look at the map representing the territory, this color code is the territory for the middle cerebral artery, lateral surface of the brain. This color code, which is the same as this and that, the territory of the anterior cerebral artery. Predominantly the medial aspect of the brain, but of course you can see a small margin, upper margin of the lateral surface of the brain, as well as you see the anterior cerebrals were running here, so it will give branches in this region as well. Then middle will run like this, posterior comes like this, anterior goes like this, right and left, they both go through here. So they'll supply that region. Middle come out like this, so they'll supply there. Posterior come out like this, they'll supply the inferior surface, as well as medial surface of the occipital lobe. This map is very important because it is from this map that you're able to deduce which vessel is injured if a patient presents with a particular clinical symptom. And to give you an example of such, I will give you some questions as we finish on this topic. So those questions are going to come on your poll. There are 3 questions which are coming on the poll. So I'm giving you only 3 minutes. You already have them. So let's see how you've performed here. So on the first question, Majority of you have gotten it wrong. You know, you have to tailor what we've said under blood supply to the brain, specifically blood supply to the cerebral cortex. You have to tailor that with the functional localization of the cerebral cortex. So you have to think through this way. For you to get motor aphasia, it means which part of the brain have you injured? Which gyrus? Anyone? Which gyrus have we injured so that we get motor aphasia?
Inferior frontal gyrus.
Good, inferior frontal gyrus. And if you injure inferior frontal gyrus, you get motor aphasia. You now know that. This is Broca's area. So you ask yourself, out of these three arteries, which one supplies the inferior frontal gyrus? So which artery would that be? Anyone? Okay, you're lost. I told you that posterior cerebral artery supplies the inferior surface of the temporal lobe, as well as medial surface of the occipital lobe. Anterior cerebral artery supplies the medial surface of the cerebral hemispheres, predominantly involving frontal and parietal cortices. Middle cerebral artery predominantly supplies the lateral surface of the hemisphere. It runs within the lateral sulcus. So back to you, out of these three arteries, which one will actually supply the Broca's cortex? Okay, no volunteer. We'll go to the next one. After you've gotten that, you'll get that one right. Second question. So the second question here is, we have paralysis of the lower limb. So for you to paralyze the lower limb, it means we've affected something. Most likely, which gyrus? Anyone?
Precentral gyrus.
Yes, so we've affected pre-central gyrus. We have paralysis of the lower limb. So we talked about the homunculus, and we said that the brain topographically represents different parts of the body. So which part of the pre-central gyrus, if injured, you'll get paralysis of the lower limb? Which part of the pre-central gyrus? Anyone? From the homunculus, which part of the precentral gyrus will give you, controls the lower limb? Is it the medial aspect of the precentral gyrus? Is it the middle part of the precentral gyrus? Or is it the lateral
part?
There?
The medial part.
The medial part of the precentral gyrus. Good. So which artery then supplies the medial aspect of the precentral gyrus? Is it middle? Is it anterior? Is it posterior cerebral? Okay, so you make that judgment, then you get the answer there. The last question. Inability to understand language, which means we are affecting which part of the brain, which gyrus or which functional area? Which gyrus or which functional cortex?
Wernicke's.
Yes, so we are affecting the Wernicke's cortex. If you're affecting Wernicke's cortex, then you ask yourself, is Wernicke on the lateral aspect? Is it on the medial aspect? or is it on the inferior aspect and the occipital? So then you get your answer on which artery. That is how you work out vascular syndromes. And when I ask you these questions again, that's how I'll ask you neuroanatomy questions regarding the cerebral cortex. You have to integrate with functions. Okay, so that's it. Now you'll know your responses if you follow what I've told you. I want to give you an assignment. This assignment, you're not doing it today. It is with regard to what I've told you about blood supply to the cerebral cortex. So at your own time, go read on anterior cerebral syndrome, middle cerebral syndrome, and posterior cerebral syndrome. You are going to get clinical symptoms which are due to occlusion of each of those arteries. So if you occlude anterior cerebral artery, you get what we call anterior cerebral syndrome. If you occlude middle cerebral artery, you get middle cerebral syndrome. If you occlude posterior cerebral artery, you get posterior cerebral syndrome. So you'll get the clinical symptoms associated with their occlusion. What is important from anatomy point of view is for you to indicate the anatomical basis for each of the clinical symptoms that you'll have talked about. For example, if someone has middle cerebral artery syndrome, you've occluded the middle cerebral artery. So you are going to affect different functional regions of the brain. Let's say you affect the Broca's cortex. So this person will not be able to talk, the first question I gave you. So the reason why someone gets Broca's aphasia is because, or the reason why someone becomes motor aphasic, they cannot talk, is because you've injured the Broca's area. So that becomes the anatomical basis. Why would someone not be able to talk if you block the middle cerebral artery? The reason is because you've injured the Broca's area. Why would someone not be able to talk if you block the, why would someone not be able to understand language if you block the middle cerebral artery? It's because you've injured the Wernicke's cortex. And why is someone going to have paralysis of the lower limb if you injure or if you block the anterior cerebral? Is because you've affected the medial aspect of the Pre-Central Gyrus. So that's how you work out for those questions, and please take it serious. I'll not follow it up, maybe. No, I have some questions on it actually. So when we meet again, I'll give you projected questions on form of poll, and we agree that this is part of your assignment marks. So just read. When we meet again, I'll give you those ones. Then I'll see how you fared on. I'll be giving another assignment again. Those ones we'll be doing next week, don't worry. So you have a whole week to read on them. Okay, I'll now give you a break, tea break for that matter, I think. When we come back, we'll look at basal ganglia, the encephalon, and cerebellum.